All right, lesson 9.4, solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So what does it mean to complete the square? Well, completing the square is when we have quadratic functions like these here. We see a and b, where we see that we only have ax squared plus bx. There is no c value, or c equals 0. In completing the square, what we do is we add our own c value to the end of this to turn this into a perfect square trinomial. So the next question is probably, well, what's a perfect square trinomial? Well, a perfect square trinomial is the product of a special product like a plus b squared. So for example, if I have here x plus 5 squared, we know that the answer to an a plus b squared, because we learned this already, is first term squared in the front, second term squared in the back, and in the middle, multiply the first term and the second term and then double it. So in other words, 2ab. For example, in x plus 5 squared, first term squared in the front, so we have x squared in the front, second term squared in the back, so in the back 5 times 5 is 25, and in the middle, multiply these two terms together and double it. So 5 times x is 5x, and double that and we get 10x. So this here, x squared plus 10x plus 25, is called a perfect square trinomial because it comes from this binomial squared, this binomial multiplied by itself. All right, so now let's learn the steps for completing the square using example A, x squared plus 6x. Remember, what we want to do is add a c value here that is going to make this into a perfect square trinomial. And the way we do this is very simple. All we're going to do is take half of b, in other words, take the b value, divide it by 2, and then we're going to square that. So our b value here is 6. So we're going to do 6 divided by 2 squared. So what is 6 divided by 2? 3. So now we have 3 squared, and what is 3 squared? 9. So this 9 is going to be our new c value, and we're going to add it right here. Now, why do we want to go through this? Well, because now we could take this perfect square trinomial, x squared plus 6x plus 9, and factor it as a special product. This is an a plus b squared. So x squared plus 6x plus 9, x squared comes from x, and 9 comes from 3 times 3. So this factors to x plus 3 squared. Now, if you get a little stuck or confused about what number to put here, it's very easy to tell, because that is the number that we got when we did b divided by 2. You see there's a 3 here, and that's what we put here. All right, so let's take a look at example B, x squared minus 9x. So we want to add our c value here. Remember, all we need to do is take our b value, divide it by 2, and then square it. So our b value here is negative 9. So negative 9 divided by 2 is negative 4.5. And negative 4.5 squared is 20.25. So this becomes the c value that we're going to add right here. And once again, the reason why we're doing this is because now we could factor this as a special product. Since there's a minus in the middle, this is now an a minus b squared. So x squared comes from x minus, and if you get a little stuck on where 20.25 comes from, or what number comes here, that's very simply the number we got when we divided b by 2. So that is negative 4.5. So this perfect square trinomial factored is x minus 4.5 squared. All right, so now go ahead and pause the video and try to complete these three. You're going to complete the square and then factor it. All right, so for number 2, we have x squared plus 10x. So we're going to do b divided by 2 squared. Our b value is 10. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared equals 25. So this is what we're going to add as our c value, 25. So here is our perfect square trinomial. So now let's go ahead and factor it. Now we see that everything's positive, so this is going to be an a plus b squared. So x squared comes from x, and if you're having trouble remembering where 25 came from, it's what we got when we did b divided by 2. So this becomes x plus 5 squared. And that's it. Looking at number 3, we have x squared minus 4x. So once again, we're going to do b divided by 2 squared. So we have here negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared is positive 4. So that is what we're going to add on the end here. So our perfect square trinomial is x squared minus 4x plus 4. And since the middle is negative, this is an a minus b squared. So once again, x squared comes from x. And where did 4 come from? Well, what did we get when we did b divided by 2? We got negative 2. So it is x minus 2 squared. All right, so now number 4, we have x squared plus 7x. So again, we're going to do b divided by 2 squared. Our b value is 7. And 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. And 3.5 squared is 12.25. So that's what we're adding on to the end here. This is our perfect square trinomial, and now we need to factor it. Everything's positive, so this is an a plus b squared. X squared comes from x, and 12.25 came from 3.5. So our factored answer is x plus 3.5 squared. All right, so now that we've practiced completing a square, let's go ahead and use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation. So we have the equation here, x squared minus 16x equals negative 15. Notice that I copied it again, that negative 15 is on the right side. I have not set this equation equal to 0 as we do in other methods for solving quadratic equations. When solving by completing the square, we do not want to set the equation equal to 0. We actually do not want there to be a c value here because we want to add our own c value. And notice that I did leave a space in between the negative 16x and the equal sign, and that's because we're going to go ahead and add our own c value. So let's go ahead and find that. Remember, we take our b value, which is negative 16, we're going to divide that by 2, and then we're going to square it. So negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8, and negative 8 squared is 64. So we're going to add a 64 here. But remember the rule for working with equations. You can never do something to just one side of an equation. Whatever you do to the left, you must also do to the right. So if I'm going to add a 64 to the left side of this equation, I also need to add a 64 to the right side of this equation. So now this gives us the equation x squared minus 16x plus 64 equals, and negative 15 plus 64 is 49. Now we need to go ahead and factor the left side. Remember, that's the reason behind completing the square, is that this left side is now a perfect square trinomial that we can factor easily into a special product. With the minus in between, this is going to be an a minus b squared. X squared comes from x, and 64 came from negative 8. So x minus 8 squared equals 49. Now from this point on, the rest of the steps are the same as the steps we used when we did solving quadratic equations by taking the square root. We don't want this x minus 8 squared. We don't want this exponent of 2. So we need to take the square root. And whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other side. So the square root of x minus 8 squared is just x minus 8. And the square root of 49, remember, is positive or negative 7. So this leads us into two equations we have to solve. One equation is going to be x minus 8 equals positive 7, and the other equation is going to be x minus 8 equals negative 7. In the first equation, we add 8 to both sides, and we get x equals 15. And in the second equation, we're going to add 8 to both sides as well, except this time negative 7 plus 8 is 1. So these are our two solutions, x equals 15 and x equals 1. All right, so now go ahead and pause the video and see if you can answer questions 5, 6, and 7 by completing the square. Let's take a look at question number 5. Once again, you see I left a gap here. So we're going to take our b value, which is negative 2. We're going to divide it by 2 and then square it. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. And negative 1 squared is positive 1. So we are going to add 1 to both sides here. And this gives us the equation x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 4. Now what we want to do is factor this side. We have a negative in the middle, so this is an a minus b squared. And we're going to take x here. And where did this 1 come from? It came from negative 1 squared. So this becomes x minus 1 squared equals 4. Now we want to get rid of this exponent of 2. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. The square root of x minus 1 squared is x minus 1. And the square root of 4 is positive or negative 2. So now this becomes two equations. One equation is going to be x minus 1 equals 2, and the other equation is going to be x minus 1 equals negative 2. So now in the first equation, when we add 1 to both sides, we get x equals 3. And in the second equation, when we add 1 to both sides, negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1, we get x equals negative 1. So those are our two solutions. All right, now for number 6, let's take our b value 12. We're going to divide that by 2 and then square it. 12 divided by 2 is 6, and 6 squared is 36. So we're going to add 36 to both sides here, giving us the equation m squared plus 12m plus 36 equals 28. And now we can go ahead and factor this left side. Everything is positive, so this is going to be an a plus b squared. M squared comes from m, and 36 comes from 6. So m plus 6 squared equals 28. Now we want to get rid of this exponent of 2, so we're going to take the square root of both sides. The square root of m plus 6 squared is m plus 6. And the square root of 28. Now 28 is not a perfect square, so we can simplify this. So if I just write this over here, let me do this in purple. If I think of the factors of 28, 28 comes from 4 times 7. So I want to rewrite this as the square root of 4 times 7. Now why do I want to do that? Well, because 4 is a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. So now what I can do is I can take these and separate them into their own square roots. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 7, and the square root of 4 is 2. So this becomes 2 times the square root of 7, or just 2 radical 7. So this is what the square root of 28 simplified is, 2 radical 7. So we get the equation m plus 6 equals positive or negative 2 radical 7. So now we have our two equations. One equation is going to be m plus 6 equals positive 2 radical 7. And the second equation is m plus 6 equals negative 2 radical 7. So now we can solve. The first equation, we subtract 6 from both sides. And this gives us m equals negative 6 plus 2 radical 7. In the second equation, we subtract 6 from both sides. And this gives us the equation m equals negative 6 minus 2 radical 7. So those are our two solutions. All right, now looking at number 7, notice that it's equal to 0. And we have a c value here, but we don't want this c value. We want to add our own c value. So we need to get rid of this positive 27. Now we could do that by subtracting 27, or just taking this 27 and moving it to the other side, which will make it a negative 27. That will make our equation 3g squared minus 24g equals negative 27. Now another thing we could do here is we could simplify this equation. If we look at all three of these terms can be divided by 3. So let's go ahead and do that. So 3g squared divided by 3 is g squared. Negative 24g divided by 3 is 8g. And negative 27 divided by 3 is negative 9. And if you're wondering how can we do that, well, remember, we divided both sides of the equation by 3. And you could do whatever you want to an equation as long as you do it equally to both sides. So now we have g squared minus 8g equals negative 9. And now we need to find our new c value. So we're going to take our b value here, negative 8 divided by 2, then square it. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 squared is 16. So we're going to add 16 to both sides. This gives us g squared minus 8g plus 16 equals 7. And now we can go ahead and factor the left side of this. Since there's a minus in the middle, this is going to be an a minus b squared. So g squared comes from g, and 16 comes from negative 4. So this becomes g minus 4 squared equals 7. And now we don't want this exponent of 2, so we have to take the square root of both sides. So g minus 4 squared, the square root of g minus 4 squared is g minus 4. And the square root of 7, 7 is not a perfect square, and we can't simplify it, so we're just going to leave this as positive or negative radical 7. And now we get our two equations. Let's put them here. So we're going to have g minus 4 equals positive radical 7, and g minus 4 equals negative radical 7. So now in both cases here, we're going to add 4 to both sides. We're going to add 4 to both sides of this first equation, and this gives us our first solution, g equals 4 plus radical 7. And in the second equation, we're going to add 4 to both sides, and this gives us our solution, g equals 4 minus radical 7. So these are our two solutions. All right, so now for our next example here, finding maximum and minimum values. Now remember that the graph of a quadratic function is a U-shape called a parabola, and that graph can open upward or downward. What determines how it opens is the a value of the function. If the a value is positive, like here in example A, we have y equals positive x squared plus 4x minus 1, then that parabola opens upward, and that makes the vertex of that parabola the lowest point on the graph, which would mean the y value of that vertex is the minimum value for the quadratic function. Now, if the quadratic function has a negative a value, like we see here in example B, we have a negative x squared, then that parabola is going to open downward, which would make the vertex the highest point on the graph. That would make the y value of the vertex the maximum value. So then how are we going to go ahead and determine the maximum or minimum value of these quadratic functions? Well, what we're going to do is rewrite these functions in vertex form by completing the square. All right, so looking at example A, we have y equals x squared plus 4x minus 1. Our a value is positive, which means that our parabola is going to open upward, which means that the vertex will be a minimum value. So how are we going to find that value? We're going to convert this into vertex form. And the way we're going to do that is by completing the square. Now notice the right side, we have x squared plus 4x minus 1. We have this c value of negative 1 that we don't want. We want to put our own c value in there. So we have to move this negative 1 to the other side. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. So this gives us y plus 1 equals x squared plus 4x. And now we can add our c value. So let's take our b value, 4. We're going to divide it by 2 and square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So we're going to add 4. And again, when you work with an equation, you can't do something to just one side. You have to do it to both sides. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. And this gives us the equation y plus 5 equals x squared plus 4x plus 4. And now we could factor this right side. Everything's positive, so it's going to be an a plus b squared. X squared comes from x, and this 4 comes from 2. So x plus 2 squared. Now to finish putting this into vertex form, we need to take this plus 5 and move it back over. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. And that gives us the equation y equals x plus 2 squared minus 5. And so our vertex is the point. Remember, we take the opposite of this number because it's x minus h. So the opposite of this number, comma this number. So the opposite of positive 2 is negative 2. So the vertex is at the point negative 2, comma negative 5. And the minimum value is the y value. So the minimum value on this function is going to be negative 5. So looking at example B, we have y equals negative x squared plus 2x plus 7. We see that our a value is negative, so this parabola is going to open downward, which is going to make our vertex the maximum value. So we need to go ahead and put this into vertex form. We see once again that we have this plus 7. We don't want the c value, we want our own, so we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. And this gives us y minus 7 equals negative x squared plus 2x. Now our next issue is we don't want this negative. So we're going to factor this negative out. So we're going to write it like this. Y minus 7 equals negative x squared, and then 2x divided by negative 1. This is going to be negative 2x. And now we can go ahead and add our c value. So we take our negative 2, which is our b value, divided by 2 squared. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, and negative 1 squared is positive 1. So we're going to add 1 here and to the other side, except, see this negative out here? This negative is going to affect what we put here. So here it's a positive 1, but because of this negative, right, negative times positive 1 is actually negative 1. So on this side, we got to put it over here as a negative 1. And that's because of this negative. So we end up with y minus 8 equals negative x squared minus 2x plus 1. And now we can factor this. So this is going to be, this negative stays here, right? X squared comes from x, and 1 came from negative 1 squared. So x minus 1 squared. And we have to get rid of this negative 8, move it back over to the other side. So we're going to add 8 to both sides. And this gives us our equation. Y equals negative times x minus 1 squared plus 8. So now our vertex is at the point, remember, opposite of this number, so positive 1, comma, positive 8. Since our a value is negative, the parabola is opening downward. That makes our vertex the maximum value. So the y value here is 8. So the maximum value for this quadratic function is 8. All right, pause the video, try these 3 questions, and then come back and see how you did. All right, looking at number 9, we see that our a value is negative. That means this parabola is going to open downward, making the vertex the maximum value. So now we need to take this and put this in vertex form. So what we need to do is we want to put our own c value in here. So we want to get rid of this positive 4 by subtracting 4 from both sides. This gives us y minus 4 equals negative x squared minus 4x. And just like the last example we looked at, we don't want this negative. So now we have to factor that negative 1 out. So we get y minus 4 equals, factor out that negative 1, and this gives us x squared, and negative 4x divided by negative 1 is positive 4x. And now we can go ahead and find our new c value. So we're going to take our b value, which is 4, divide that by 2, and then square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So we're going to add 4 to this side, and because we're also going to add 4 to the other side, but because of this negative here, we're actually going to add a negative 4 to this side. So this gives us y minus 8 equals negative times x squared plus 4x plus 4. And now we can factor this. We keep the negative here, and this is going to be an a plus b, so x plus something squared. Where did 4 come from? 2. So x plus 2 squared. And now we want to get rid of this negative 8, so we have to add 8 to both sides, giving us our equation in vertex form. Y equals negative x plus 2 squared plus 8. So our vertex is the point negative 2, comma 8. And so we know, again, a negative a value, so this is going to be a maximum. So the maximum is 8. Looking at number 10, we see that the a value here is positive. So this parabola is going to open upward, which would mean that we're dealing with a minimum value. So we have to get rid of this 40 because we want to put in our own c value. So we're going to subtract 40 from both sides. This gives us y minus 40 equals x squared plus 12x. And now we can go ahead and add our c value. So 12 divided by 2 is 6, and 6 squared is 36. So we're going to add 36 to both sides of this equation. On the left, we end up with y equals y minus 4 equals, and then x squared plus 12x plus 36. And now we can factor. Again, everything's positive, so this is an a plus b squared. So we get x, and 36 comes from 6. So x plus 6 squared, and then all we got to do is get rid of this negative 4, so we add 4 to both sides. And we get y equals x plus 6 squared plus 4. So that puts our vertex at the point negative 6 comma 4, and this is a minimum value, so the minimum is 4. All right, last one, number 11. We see that our a value is positive, so the parabola is opening upward, which is going to make this a minimum. So we want our own c value here, so we have to get rid of this negative 2. Let's add 2 to both sides. This gives us y plus 2 equals x squared minus 2x. And now we can go ahead and put in our new c value. We take our b value, divide it by 2, and square it. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, and negative 1 squared is 1. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. This gives us y plus 3 equals x squared minus 2x plus 1. And now we could factor the right side. So this is going to be an a minus b. So x squared comes from x. And where did 1 come from? Negative 1. So x minus 1 squared. And we need to move this 3 back over. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. We get y equals x minus 1 squared minus 3. So that makes our vertex 1 comma negative 3, and our minimum value is negative 3.